So we're going to have a look here at this horse skeleton. We're going to primarily look at the vertebrae. This is a very small horse skeleton. Okay, so looking at the cervical vertebra, okay, there's 7 of them, just like there is in most mammals. The only ones that don't have that are the manatees and the sloths. Okay, so they generally have 7. Even a giraffe with its very long neck only has 7. We have the atlas here. Okay, the wing of the atlas you can actually palpate on a live horse right here. And we see here a foramen that comes from the vertebral canal out through. This is the lateral vertebral foramen. Okay, there's another foramen here, right there, which is the alar foramen. This is not one that we saw in the dog. So if we look at this isolated one, this is obviously of a much bigger horse. You can see the lateral vertebral foramen, which the spinal nerve always comes through the lateral vertebral foramen, and its ventral branch is then going to go down through the alar foramen. Okay, and its dorsal branch will then just go dorsally right here. We also see here a transverse foramen. Okay, so the first 6 cervical vertebrae all have transverse foramina. Okay, we can see them all here. And that is what the vertebral artery, vein, and nerve pass through. Okay? Now we come back to the axis. Now this is a young horse. There would be a little ligament attaching right here to create a foramen. Okay, so let me grab an isolated one from a mature animal. Okay, this one has some osseous proliferation that's not generally there, but you can see real nicely here how that's ossified in. Here's that lateral vertebral foramen in the axis. Okay, whenever we have a lateral vertebral foramen, that's what the spinal nerve is going to come through. Okay, so on this one, first cervical spinal nerve comes through here, and then the second one would come through here. Okay, we also can see here that there is a dens, just like in the dog. It's not as pointy as in the dog, but it is still present. Okay, so we look on these remaining cervical vertebra, and the dorsal spinous process is not very prominent. Okay, not till we get back here and we start to get a little bit bigger, and of course we have a very nice one here on the axis. The transverse processes are these guys coming out here. Notice that at C6 there's a very much enlarged one, and it's more ventral, and that one looks kind of like sled runners. Okay, so that's one that you use when you're doing a radiograph kind of as a landmark. Okay, and then we come back here at 7. We can't see it so much at this one because this is a young horse, but there may be actually a caudal costal fovea right here where the head of the first rib articulates. Okay, so when we look at cervical vertebra 3 through 7, they all have the lamina and the pedicle, transverse process, very small spinous processes, and the first through 6 have these transverse foramina. Okay, so here looking at the thoracic vertebra now, these are much smaller in length, okay, from cranial to caudal, but they're much taller. And we can see here from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, this is what makes up the withers. Okay, that as well as the scapular cartilages and the other muscle, the epaxial muscles in here, are going to make up the withers. Okay, now I'm going to take us over to the larger specimen to look at some of these other vertebrae. Okay, so here we have a much larger horse specimen. We see the atlas and the axis, the cervical vertebra here, the 6th with that sled runner, and this will be the 7th, and then here's our first thoracic vertebra, remember the ribs are always articulating at the cranial aspect, and so we do see here a nice caudal costal fovea in that 7th cervical vertebra. And so we obviously have a cranial costal fovea and then a caudal costal fovea in the 1st thoracic vertebra. So we can see that once again the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, that's going to make up the withers. Okay, so we can see in here once again we also have cranial and a caudal notch, okay, vertebral notch. This caudal and cranial vertebral notch here are going to make up what we call the intervertebral foramen. Sometimes we see on horses, and both in the thoracic and or the lumbar area, we may see these guys kind of close off right here. Okay, don't see it on this guy, but I have seen it where on one side of a horse there were multiple that were closed off, creating a lateral vertebral foramen through which that spinal nerve would come through. Okay, so we have the dorsal spinous process. The transverse process is what articulates with the tubercle of the rib. Okay, the head of the rib articulates at the caudal and cranial costal fovea. Okay, so moving back this way, we see the slope of our spinous processes start to slope more in the cranial direction. Okay, back into the lumbar region, we have very prominent transverse processes coming out. Okay, and everything's more sloping in that cranial direction. We also have very prominent articular processes. So we're going to have both a cranial and a caudal articular process that are going to articulate with each other. If we come up back up to the cervical region, we can see those here. So this is the caudal articular process and the cranial articular process here. Okay, now notice the articular surface here. In the cranial one, it's kind of up and in a little bit. As we come back into the thoracic vertebra, it's more flattened. Okay, so this would be, the cranial would be the articular surface this way, the caudal more like this. But then when we get back here, it's more in like this for the cranial and out for the caudal. So the way I remember that is that the cranial ones are in the front of the line looking for a handout. So their articular surfaces are like this in relation to my palms. Okay, whereas the caudal ones, they're more down and out because they're in the back of the line, they're sad, they're down and out. Okay? So those are the articular processes. We also have vertebral notches, not so prominent, but still creating that intervertebral foramen. Okay? So we've got 6 lumbar in the horse, and you can see that generally we have some type of articulation in these last ones here on those transverse processes, but here we see that they have fused in this animal. Okay, we'll go back over and look at the younger animal in just a sec here. Okay, coming back into the sacrum, we have 5 fused sacral vertebrae. They're usually quite individual in the spinous processes. We're starting to see some fusion here in this older animal, and we'll see a dorsal and a ventral sacral foramina. There'll be 4 on the dorsal and the ventral in between each vertebra. That is where the branches, the dorsal and ventral branches of the spinal nerves come out there. Okay? On this ventral surface of the sacrum right here is the promontory, and that is actually palpable per rectum. coming back over to this younger animal, you can see here the articulation between the last two lumbar and the last lumbar with the sacral transverse process here. Okay, so we do have a enlarged transverse process in that first sacral vertebra, and its auricular surface articulates with the ilium. Okay, in this one we can see the caudal vertebra. Generally there's 15 to 20, just kind of rounding to 20 is good. Now some differences that we see is, as we said, there's 18 thoracic vertebra. In Mustangs we may see only 17, and there's 6 lumbar vertebra. In Mustangs we may only see 5. Also in Arabian horses there may only be 5, which gives them that shorter back. Okay? So just to repeat some of the common structures within our vertebra, we've got the body here, we have pedicles and then lamina, we have the cranial and caudal articular processes, the cranial and caudal vertebral notches, the dorsal spinous process, sometimes just referred to as the spinous process, and the transverse process. Okay? Now looking at the bovine, it's going to be very much similar. Okay, also in the smaller goat, we see here we still have that lateral vertebral foramen and the alar foramen. Okay, but we do not have a transverse foramen in the atlas. Okay, the axis seems a little more stout. That lateral vertebral foramen is quite large. We still have the transverse foramen or canal here. Okay, we come back here once again at C6. We have that enlarged transverse process, that sled runner. Okay, we only have 13 thoracic vertebra. As you can see here, where it has closed off to create one of those lateral vertebral foramen right here. Sometimes we'll see that also. Yeah, we do. So we can see that here back in the lumbar area as well on this specimen. So there are lateral vertebral foramen on these lumbar vertebra as well as this, some of these thoracic vertebra. We still have that intervertebral foramen. Okay, so the spinal nerve will come through here, the vessels will pass through here. Okay, the transverse processes are much more exaggerated here, much easier to palpate on a bovine. On their sacrum, they also have 5, but they have this median sacral crest rather than the individual spines, much similar to the dog. I'm going to take a minute to just go over the general structures of a vertebra, and these are vertebra from a sheep. Here we've got a cervical vertebra. I know that because we have the transverse foramina here. Okay, and we can tell that this is the caudal aspect because it's concave, and this one is convex on the body. Also, the cranial articular processes, their articular surface is more in and up, okay, whereas the caudal one is more down and out. Okay, and so we've got the body, we've got the pedicles, and we have the lamina. We have, as I said, the articular processes, the cranial and caudal one. We have vertebral notches here, so we have a cranial vertebral notch, caudal vertebral notch. We have the dorsal spinous process, sometimes just referred to as spinous process, and then this portion out here is the transverse process. Okay, so let's look at a lumbar vertebra. Once again, we have going articular surface more in is the cranial articular processes. This one that's more out is the caudal. We have a nice little caudal vertebral notch, not so much of a cranial one here. Okay, once again, the body is more convex on the cranial aspect, concave on the caudal aspect. We have the spinous process and the transverse processes. The pedicle, which are like the walls, and then the lamina, which are like the roof. And then that is the vertebral canal.